a frozen outpost, a dying woman in blue velvet, and a man who refused to let the wolves win. Clara Sterling was told she could never bear children, but the unforgiving frontier had a different plan when two broken orphans knocked on her cabin door. Today's tale proves that love isn't found in easy places. It's built in the hardest seasons. If you believe that being needed is better than being unchosen, please comment your thoughts, share, and subscribe to our Frontier family.
The wind had a way of cutting through the Bitterroot Valley before you even saw the clouds. It didn't ask for permission. It just arrived, sharp as a broken blade, testing whatever a man had built and waiting to see what gave way first. Colton Vance was 36, and he'd spent enough seasons in Montana to know the signs. He knew the heavy, flat shade of gray the sky took on when it was loading up for a real freeze. He knew the way the pines on the ridge went dead still right before the air turned to ice. He was out on the north boundary of his land, pulling wire tight on a section of downed fence. The kind of slow, numbing work that leaves a man's hands raw and his mind drifting back to things he'd rather leave buried. He heard the horses before he saw them, two sets of iron-shod hooves crunching loud on the frozen mud of the trail. Out here, you always looked up when you heard something coming. It was an occupational habit. You kept track of what was actually there instead of what you hoped would be. It was Jed Tanner, riding past the Vance property line. Jed was a man Colton managed to tolerate only because geography demanded it. He ran the stone quarries over on the eastern ridge, a hard, blunt operation run by a hard, blunt man. Jed was the kind of neighbor who measured the world entirely by what he could own, what he could break, and what he could bend to his will. But Jed wasn't alone today. Sitting in the wagon beside him was a woman Colton had never seen before. She sat straight on the wooden bench, her spine rigid against the jolting of the wheel ruts. She wore a traveling cloak of fine blue velvet, fitted neat at the shoulders. It was a beautiful thing, the kind of garment meant for a carriage ride in Boston or a paved street in a city with street lamps. Out here in the Bitterroot in late November, it was about as useful as a good intention. The wind was already knifing through it, and even from the distance of his fence line, Colton could see the tight, strained set of her jaw. She was holding herself perfectly still, the way people do when they are trying with everything they have not to shiver in front of a cruel man. She had dark hair, pinned up loose under a velvet bonnet, and she was looking out at the jagged, gray teeth of the mountains with a measured expression. Not fear, not wonder, either. It was the look of a person taking an inventory of a very difficult place. Jed didn't look over at the fence line. He was staring straight between his horse ears, his face set hard. Colton dropped his wire stretchers. He didn't like the look of it. He didn't like the look of her out here in a scrap of city cloth with a storm making in the north. He walked his horse down to the edge of the trail, cutting off the path just enough to force Jed to pull back on the reins. The wagon groaned to a halt. The horses breathed out long, white plumes of steam into the bitter air. "Vance," Jed said, his voice flat as a slate stone. He didn't offer a hand. "Tanner," Colton replied. His voice was lower, carrying the easy, slow cadence of the valley. He didn't look at Jed. He looked at the woman. Close up, he could see the faint purple shadows under her eyes, the sheer exhaustion etched into the fine lines of her face. "Ma'am," she gave a small, careful nod. "Good day, sir." Her voice was soft, carrying the proper, clipped accent of the East, but it didn't tremble. Colton respected that. Montana was currently doing its best to break her, and she was refusing to let it show. Jed shifted on the bench, his leather gloves creaking. "We remaking time. Colton, the wind's picking up and I've got a contract to fulfill at the ranch." Colton reached out, his gloved hand resting easy on his saddle horn. He let his gaze drift over the thin velvet of her cloak, then back to Jed's heavy, fur-lined coat. The contrast was loud. It was a statement without words. Jed's horses were blanketed, well-fed, and cared for because they represented a financial return. The woman beside him was being treated with less regard than the livestock. This Montana frost don't care about a man's pride. Jed, Colton said. He kept his tone level, but there was a hard edge beneath the rhythm of his words. But driving a lady out here in nothing but a scrap of velvet, a man with any real self-respect wouldn't allow it. The cold out here will take a person's life before they even realize they're freezing. Jed's jaw tightened. He let out a short, ugly laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The lady is Clara Sterling. She's my business from here on out. Vance. The Boston agency gave their word she was hardy enough for the frontier. What she wears on my wagon ain't your concern. Clara didn't flinch at the word business, but Colton saw her fingers tighten into small, pale fists against the fabric of her skirt. She looked down at the floorboards of the wagon, her expression locking down tight, closing herself off from the humiliation of being discussed like a head of cattle at an auction block. Colton didn't move his horse. He stayed right where he was, a solid, unyielding weight in the middle of the men trail. He looked at Clara, making sure his eyes were steady and clear. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice dropping into something gentler, something meant just for her. "The Bitterroot is a grand place, but it's thinned out. It takes a lot of learning. If you ever find yourself needing a warm hearth or an honest hand, the Vance property stays open. Remember that name." Vance. She looked up then. Her dark eyes met his, and for a split second, the calculation vanished. There was a sudden, sharp flash of understanding between them, a recognition of safety. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she whispered. "I will remember." Jed snapped the lines. His face darkened with a sudden, venomous heat. "We're done talking, Colton. Get." The wagon surged forward, the heavy wooden wheels churning up the frozen grit of the road. Colton wheeled his horse around and watched them go. He watched the blue velvet cloak disappear around the bend where the timber grew thick and gray against the mountain. He stood there for a long time, the wire stretcher cold in his hand, the wind rising to a whistle through the pine needles. The air was changing fast now. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the first small, hard flakes of snow were beginning to tap against the brim of his hat. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself a neighbor's personal arrangements didn't belong on his slate of concerns. He had cattle to move to the lower pasture, a roof to patch on the south barn, and a solitary life to maintain. But the silence that followed the wagon was heavy. It was the kind of unease that settles into the back of a man's mind and refuses to be evicted, no matter how firmly you tell it to leave. The road to the eastern ridge did not get any smoother. If anything, the rocks grew larger. The ruts grew deeper. The wagon groaned under the strain, a low metallic complaint that seemed to mimic the mood on the wooden bench. Jed Tanner did not speak. He kept his eyes fixed on the horses, his jaw working a piece of tobacco with a slow, rhythmic violence. Clara Sterling held onto the iron rail at the side of the seat. Every jolt sent a sharp ache up her spine. Her hands, encased in thin city leather, were already losing their feeling. The blue velvet cloak, which had seemed so grand when she boarded the train in Boston, felt like tissue paper now. The Montana wind did not just blow against you. It hunted you. It found every seam, every loose stitch, every small gap in your clothing, and it pressed its icy fingers directly against your skin. She looked at the landscape shifting around them. The trees were changing. The soft green pines of the lower valley were gone, replaced by stunted, twisted larches that clung to the gray stone with a desperate tenacity. It was a harsh country, beautiful, yes, but in a way that felt entirely indifferent to whether a person lived or died. "Tanner," Clara said. Her voice was cracked, a thin sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind. She swallowed, trying to bring some moisture back to her throat. "How much further to the homestead?" Jed didn't look at her. He didn't even shift his gaze from the horse's ears. "Far enough," he grunted. "The horses are dragging. The cold makes them sluggish." Clara hesitated. The secret she carried had been burning a hole in her chest since they left the supply post. She had meant to tell him earlier. She had meant to write it in the letters, but the words had felt too heavy on paper. They felt too final. But seeing the vast, empty space around her, and seeing the hard, unyielding profile of the man she was supposed to marry, She knew she couldn't start a life on a lie. Out here, a lie wasn't just a moral failing. It was a flaw in the foundation. It would bring the whole house down eventually. "There is something we must speak on," Clara said, her voice rising with a sudden, quiet determination. Something the agency did not put in the paperwork. Jed pulled slightly on the reins, slowing the team to a heavy walk. The sudden lack of mechanical noise made the silence of the mountain feel even larger. "Speak then," he said. "I ain't got time for riddles." "Before I left Boston," she began, her eyes fixed on her own lap, "I visited a physician, a specialist. There was an accident when I was a child, a fall from a carriage. I was told. He told me that it is highly unlikely I will ever be able to bear children." The words sat in the freezing air between them, dead and heavy. Jed didn't move for 3 full heartbeats. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes were small, dark slits beneath the brim of his hat. The grease from the wagon wheels seemed to have settled into the lines around his mouth. "What did you say?" "I cannot have children, Mr. Tanner," she said, looking up to meet his gaze. She refused to look away. She owed him the truth, but she did not owe him her shame. "I know your letters spoke of a family, of a legacy. I felt it only right that you knew before we reached the church." Jed's face didn't just harden. It went entirely blank. It was the look of a trader who had just realized the cattle he purchased were diseased. "A legacy," he whispered, his voice rising into a harsh, jagged edge. "A family, girl. I didn't pay the agency $300 for a companion to read books to me by the fire. I bought a wife, a woman to build this ranch, to give me sons to work the quarry, to keep the name alive on this land. I can work," Clara said, her voice tightening. "I know plants. I know bookkeeping. I can tend the house a mule can work." Jed spat his hand, slamming down on the wooden brake lever. "An ox can pull. I don't need a schoolteacher from Boston to help me account for my stone. I needed a woman who was whole." The word whole hit her like a physical blow. It was an old injury, a weapon society had used against her for years. But hearing it out here, in the shadow of the mountains, made it feel even more brutal. Jed pulled the wagon to a dead stop. They were standing in front of an old timber outpost, a half-collapsed line shack left over from the old freighting days. The roof was sagging under the weight of old gray ice, and the door hung crooked on a single rusted hinge. It was an abandoned place, a monument to things that hadn't lasted. "Get down," Jed said. His voice was quiet now. Cold, Clara blinked, the frost on her eyelashes heavy. "What?" I said. "Get down from my wagon." He didn't look at her. He reached behind the seat, grabbed her small leather trunk, and swung it over the side. It hit the frozen dirt with a dull, hollow thud, the axles throwing grease. "It's unbonded. I gotta take the team up to the upper forge to get it set right. You wait here." Here, Clara looked at the rotting shack. The wind was howling through the gaps in the logs. The sky above them was turning a dark, bruised shade of purple. "Mr. Tanner, there is a storm coming. You saw the clouds. Mr. Vance warned you." "Vance is a soft-hearted fool," Jed said, his voice entirely devoid of heat. "The stagecoach from the northern route comes past this way station twice a week. It'll be along. You wait inside out of the wind. I'll be back for you when the wagon's right." It was a lie. Clara knew it was a lie the moment she looked into his eyes. There was no grease on the axle. There was no stagecoach coming. A man like Jed Tanner didn't fix things he considered broken. He discarded them. He was leaving her here, miles from the nearest settlement, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a trunk full of books. He was letting the mountain do the work he didn't have the stomach to do himself with a gun. "You are leaving me," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had gone as flat and cold as his. "I am taking care of my property." "Jed," he reached over, his rough hand catching her by the forearm, his grip turning her skin white even through the wool. He didn't pull her, but the weight of his hand was a command. "Get down, Clara. Don't make me use a whip on a lady." She didn't wait for him to touch her again. She pulled her arm free, her movement quick and sharp with a dignity that surprised him. She stepped down onto the iron wheel hub, then onto the frozen ground. The cold hit her boots instantly, a sharp ache that traveled straight to her knees. Jed didn't wait for her to clear the trail. He snapped the lines, shouting at the team. The horses, eager to be moving toward a warm barn, lunged into the harness. The wagon rattled away, the iron-rimmed wheels throwing up small chunks of frozen mud that hit Clara's cloak like buckshot. She didn't watch him go. She turned her back on the road and looked at the outpost. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was actually colder than the trail, trapped and stale, smelling of old pine rot and the ancient droppings of mountain rats. There was an old iron stove in the corner, but the pipe was rusted through, dangling like a broken limb. Clara set her trunk down in the center of the room. Her knees were shaking now, not just from the cold, but from the sudden, massive weight of her own isolation. She was alone, truly alone, in a country that didn't know her name. She knelt by the trunk and opened the brass latches. Inside were her books, her father's poetry collections, her botany texts, her journals. They were her only wealth. She took a volume of English verse, her fingers so stiff she could barely turn the pages. She tried to tear the paper to make a nest for a fire, using a single match she found in her pocket. But the wood in the corner was damp with old snow. The match flared once, a small, pathetic spark of yellow light that showed the frost creeping up the log walls. And then it went out. The darkness came down fast after that. The wind outside rose from a whistle to a roar, a wild, directionless beast that slammed against the rotting timber of the shack. The snow began to fall in earnest, drifting through the cracks in the roof, settling on Clara's shoulders like a cold white shroud. She huddled against her leather trunk, pulling the blue velvet cloak around her knees as tightly as she could manage. She didn't cry. Tears would only freeze on her face, and she needed every drop of warmth she had left. As the cold began to numb her mind, turning her thoughts slow and heavy, she remembered the cowboy down by the fence line. Colton Vance. She remembered the steady, solid look in his eyes and the way he had said his name. Vance. It was the only warm thing left in the world. She held on to that word like a prayer, repeating it silently in the dark while the Bitterroot Valley went entirely white around her. The fire in Colton Vance's cabin was built of seasoned red larch. It burned hot and steady, throwing long, golden shadows across the hand-hewn beams of the ceiling. It was a good cabin, solid, tight and dry. A man could survive a month of Montana winter inside those walls and never feel the frost. But Colton couldn't sit still. He stood by the south-facing window, a tin cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching the blizzard erase the world outside. The wind was throwing the snow against the glass with a sound like handfuls of gravel. You couldn't see the barn 20 yards away. You couldn't see the corral. Everything was just a shifting, roaring wall of white. He had tried to work on his ledgers. He had tried to oil his saddle leather. But every time the wind slammed against the heavy log walls, he saw that blue velvet cloak again. He saw the way the woman had held herself, rigid and proud, while the cold worked its way into her bones. He heard the barn door rattle down at the bunkhouse earlier. His foreman, Silas, had come up to report that the stock was secure. Silas had looked at Colton standing by the window and said, "Tanner went past the South Fork an hour ago. Boss, he was moving fast." The wagon was empty. The words had landed in the room like lead. Empty. He probably dropped her at the house, Silas had said, shaking his hat free of snow. "It ain't our business. Colton, a man's domestic arrangements are his own. Jed Tanner don't have a house set up for a guest." "Silas," Colton said, his voice quiet. "He's got a bunkhouse full of rough quarry hands and a cabin that smells of old grease. He didn't take her there. Then she sits at the rooming house in town," Silas argued. "He was coming from town when I saw him," Colton said. He set his coffee cup down on the table with a sharp click. He wouldn't go back. He looked back out the window. The unease in his chest had turned into a hard, cold knot. Out here, human life was a fragile thing. The frontier didn't have a safety net. It didn't have a police force or a hospital within 40 miles. If a person didn't look out for their neighbor, the country just swallowed them whole. And Jed Tanner wasn't a neighbor. He was a wolf in a wool coat. Colton reached for his heavy sheepskin coat hanging by the door. "You're a fool if you go out in this," Silas said from the doorway, his eyes wide. "That wind will disorient a man in 10 paces. You won't find the road. My gray mare knows the Southern Trail better than I do," Colton said, pulling his leather gloves on and tugging the brims of his hat down tight. "If I stay here listening to this wind, I won't sleep anyway. If I am a fool, Silas, at least I'll be a fool who tried." He didn't wait for his foreman to reply. He stepped out the door and the winter hit him like a physical blow. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. The snow was a blinding, horizontal sheet that stung his eyes. In the barn, the gray mare was restless. She knew the weather was wrong. But when Colton laid his hand on her neck, speaking to her in that low, rhythmic rumble, she knew. She settled down. He threw the heavy stock saddle on her back, pulled the cinch tight, and checked his saddlebags. He packed a flask of brandy, a thick wool blanket, and a bundle of dry pine kindling. They left the barn at a slow walk. The mare moved by instinct, her hooves finding the hard pack of the trail beneath the fresh drifts. Colton kept his chin tucked into his collar, one hand loose on the reins, trusting the animal's feet. The world was entirely gone. There were no landmarks, no trees, no ridges, just the gray twilight of a Montana blizzard and the sound of his own breathing. It took him 2 hours to cover 3 miles. By the time the dark shape of the old stone outpost loomed out of the white, Colton's face was numb and his fingers were stiff inside his leather gloves. The mare stopped without being asked. She pricked her ears toward the collapsed doorway of the shack. Colton swung down from the saddle. His boots sank knee-deep into a fresh drift. He pushed through the crooked door, his hand instinctively going to the small lantern he'd unhooked from his saddle. He struck a match against his thigh, the yellow flare revealing the small, frozen room. She was there. Clara was curled against her leather trunk in the far corner, her knees pulled to her chest. The blue velvet cloak was covered in a fine dusting of snow that had blown through the roof. Her face was white as stone, her lips a faint, alarming shade of blue. Her eyes were closed. Colton dropped to his knees beside her. He set the lantern down and pulled his gloves off with his teeth. He laid his bare hand against her cheek. It was cold, the deep, quiet cold that meant a person was halfway out of this world already. "Miss Sterling," he said. He shook her shoulder, gently at first, then harder. "Clara, hear me." A low, cracked sound came from her throat. Her eyelids fluttered, but they didn't open. She was sliding into that deep sleep from which the frontier rarely let a person wake. Colton didn't hesitate. He didn't think about Jed Tanner or what the town would say about a wealthy rancher taking another man's bride. Out here, the rules of society were secondary to the rules of survival. You saved the life in front of you first. You argued about the paperwork later. He lifted her up. She was dead weight, her small frame rigid with the frost. He carried her out to the mare, the wind tearing at his coat. The mare shifted, nervous about the extra burden, but Colton spoke to her sharply, his voice commanding. He managed to swing up into the saddle, holding Clara against his chest with one arm, wrapping his heavy sheepskin coat around her like a shield. The ride back was longer. The storm was at their backs now, pushing them through the dark. Colton kept his arm tight around her, feeling the faint, slow thud of her heart against his ribs. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She was just a fragile, freezing thing he had pulled out of the jaws of the mountain. When they finally broke through the trees and saw the yellow light of his cabin window, Colton let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since midnight. He kicked the door open with his boot. The warmth of the room hit them like a wave. Silas was there, waiting by the hearth. He didn't ask questions. He took the mare's reins while Colton carried Clara over to the wide wooden settle near the fire. He laid her down gently. He didn't pile blankets on her immediately. He knew the frontier law of frost. You brought a frozen person back slow. You didn't rush the heat, or you damaged the blood. He took off her wet boots, his rough hands working the stiff leather with an unexpected gentleness. Her feet were white and cold as marble. He began to rub them with his bare palms, using the steady, rhythmic friction to bring the life back to her skin. Clara stirred. A long, shuddering sigh came from her lungs. Her dark eyes opened slowly, unfocused and heavy with the fog of the cold. She looked at the log ceiling, then at the roaring fire, and finally, her gaze found Colton's face. She looked at him for a long moment, the calculation returning to her eyes piece by piece. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. You came. I told you I'd be on the trail." "Ma'am," Colton said. He didn't stop rubbing her hands, his large palms completely enveloping hers. "You're at the Vance Ranch. The storm's outside, but you're under a tight roof now. You're safe." A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, freezing for a second before the warmth of the hearth melted it. She looked at her small leather trunk, which Silas had just brought through the door and set by the woodbox. It was all she had left in the world. "He left me," she said, her voice flat with the raw truth of it. "He left me because I am not whole." Colton looked down at her small, pale hands inside his own. He thought of Jed Tanner safe in his warm cabin, and a hard, dangerous anger settled into his bones. But he kept his voice steady for her. "A man who measures a woman by what she can give him instead of who she is. He ain't a man at all." "Miss Sterling," Colton said, looking straight into her eyes so she could see the truth of it. "You're a human soul, and you're worth more than every acre Jed Tanner owns. We're going to get you warm, and, tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." Clara closed her eyes again, but this time, her breathing was deeper, regular. She let her head fall back against the cushions, her body finally surrendering to the warmth of the room, while Colton Vance sat beside her in the firelight, keeping watch against the winter. The frost takes its time leaving a body. It doesn't just melt away like ice on a creek bank. It retreats inch by inch, stubborn and deep, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache that lets a person know exactly how close they came to the edge. Clara spent the first 48 hours in a fog of gray twilight. Every time she opened her eyes, the hand-hewn logs of the cabin ceiling were there, solid and dark, smelling of cured pine and beeswax. The fire in the hearth never went out. It crackled soft, throwing a steady, amber glow across the room, a stark contrast to the howling white chaos she'd left behind at the stone outpost. Colton Vance didn't crowd her. That was the first thing she truly registered when the fog in her mind began to clear. In a world where men used their size to dictate space, Colton moved with a deliberate, quiet restraint. He had hired Mrs. Gable, an elderly, sharp-eyed midwife from the lower settlement, to tend to the intimate business of her recovery. It was a move that spoke volumes without a single word being uttered. In the rough-and-tumble territories, a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily broken by the careless whispers of small-minded townsfolk. By bringing Mrs. Gable under his roof, Colton wasn't just saving Clara's life. He was actively shielding her dignity. On the third morning, the blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world that was blindingly white, still and sharp as broken glass. Clara managed to sit up on the wide wooden settle, a thick wool blanket tucked around her waist. Her feet were still bandaged, tender to the touch, but the alarming gray color had been replaced by a faint, healthy pink. The heavy cabin door groaned open, and Colton stepped inside, carrying a fresh armload of split cedar. He stopped 3 paces from the settle, his large frame silhouetted against the bright snow outside. He waited until she looked up, acknowledging him, before he stepped any closer. "Morning, Miss Sterling," he said. His voice carried that same slow, rhythmic cadence she remembered from the trail, a sound like iron wheels turning on deep soil. The weather cleared its throat. "Looks like the valleys decided to let us keep living." "Good morning, Mr. Vance," Clara said. Her voice was still thin, a little raspy from the cold, but it didn't shake. I don't quite know how to begin thanking you. Mrs. Gable told me you rode out into the worst of it alone." Colton stacked the cedar neat by the woodbox, his movements unhurried. He pulled off his heavy leather gloves, tucking them into his belt, and looked at her with steady, unblinking eyes. "Out here, we don't keep a ledger on a man's duty to his fellows, ma'am," he said, sitting down in the rough timber rocking chair across from her. He leaned his forearms on his knees, his posture relaxed but attentive. A human life isn't a stray calf you leave to the wolves because the weather's bad. You see someone in a drift, you haul 'em out. That is just the law of the country. It's what keeps us from turning into the animals we trying to raise. Clara looked down at her hands, her fingers smoothing the rough wool of the blanket. The memory of Jed Tanner's harsh, transactional glare still burned fresh in her mind. To Jed, she had been a line item on a ledger, a piece of damaged machinery to be cast aside the moment it failed to meet the specifications of the order. Mr. Tanner did not see it that way, she said softly, her chin lifting just enough to show the stubborn pride that had kept her alive in the shack. He looked at me and saw a bad investment. He told me I wasn't whole because I couldn't give him the sons he wanted for his quarries. The room went quiet, save for the soft pop of a pine knot in the hearth. Colton didn't flinch, but Clara noticed the muscles along his jaw tighten into a hard, dangerous ridge. When he spoke, his tone was low, vibrating with a quiet intensity that filled the space between them. Jed Tanner measures the world by the ton and the dollar, Miss Sterling, Colton said, each word falling heavy and deliberate. He thinks because he digs stone out of the mountain, he owns the dirt it sits on. But a woman isn't a parcel of land to be surveyed, and she sure as hell ain't a draft horse to be traded off when her knees go soft. Your worth as a human soul was settled the day you were born, and there ain't a man alive who has the right to put a price tag on that. Don't you ever let his smallness make you feel small. The sheer weight of his honesty caught her off guard. In Boston, society polite talked around a woman's limitations, treating her with a patronizing pity that felt like a slow, suffocating silk. Colton Vance didn't offer pity. He offered a plain, unvarnished truth that acted like a splint to her broken spirit. I don't intend to eat the bread of charity, Mr. Vance, Clara said, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity. As soon as these bandages come off, I will work. I can keep your books. I can tend your kitchen garden. I can mend your gear. I have an education, and I have two good hands. I will pay my way. Colton looked at her for a long moment, a faint, rare ghost of a smile touching the corners of his eyes. He stood up, towering over the hearth, but his shadow felt protective rather than imposing. Miss Sterling, you under a Vance roof, he said, reaching for his hat. We don't barter for a person's safety. You'll rest until Mrs. Gable says your feet are fit for boots. If you want to help around the place later, we'll find a chore that suits you, but you'll do it as an equal, not as an unfree debtor trying to buy her right to breathe my air. This valley's hard enough without making people beg for a warm corner. He turned and walked toward the door, his heavy boots making a firm, reassuring rhythm on the floorboards. Just before he lifted the latch, he stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Silas brought your leather trunk in from the porch, he added, nodding toward the corner near the wood box. The latch is a little stiff from the ice, but the books inside are dry. I figured a lady from Boston might want her own company while the frost finishes leaving. The door closed behind him, cutting off the bright glare of the winter sun. Clara sat back against the settle, her heart beating with a strange, unfamiliar lightness. She looked at the leather trunk in the corner. For the first time since she had boarded the train in St. Louis, the world didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a place where a person could stop running, sit by the fire, and slowly find their feet again. By the second week of December, the bandages were gone. Clara's boots fit again, though she walked with a slight, careful favor to her right side where the frostbite had dug its teeth in deepest. The routine of the Vance Ranch was a beautiful, mechanical thing. It moved with the sun. Colton was out of the cabin by 4 in the morning, his lanterns flickering down at the barns before the sky even thought about turning gray. Clara found her place in that rhythm without being asked. She took over the stove, a cast-iron beast that had previously produced nothing but scorched oats and grease-heavy stews under Colton's indifferent care. She found his flour bin, his crocks of salted lard, and his small store of dried fruit. Within 3 days, the cabin smelled of hot saleratus biscuits and chicory coffee that didn't taste like boiled leather. But her real healing didn't happen at the stove. It happened out by the South Corral. Colton had 4 horses in his working string. There was the dependable gray mare he rode through the blizzard. A solid bay quarter horse for cattle work. A young gelding he was still sizing up. And then there was the dappled stallion. The hands called the stallion horse number 4. A flat, indifferent label that felt like an insult to the animal's proud carriage. The previous owner had called him spirited. Colton privately called him a nightmare. He was a beautiful, broken thing. His coat was the color of a stormy sky, but his flanks were marred by the pale, jagged lines of an old whip hand. Every time a man came within 10 feet of the rail, the stallion's ears went flat against his skull, his eyes showing a rim of wild, frantic white. He didn't just fight the halter. He fought the air around him, treating every movement as an impending blow. "He's dangerous, Miss Sterling," Colton told her one afternoon when he found her standing by the corral fence, a piece of dried apple in her palm. "A man with a heavy hand broke his spirit before I bought the parcel he came with. He don't trust nothing that walks on 2 legs. Leave him be." Clara didn't move away from the rail. She watched the stallion bunch his muscles, his tail switching with an anxious, defensive energy. "He isn't dangerous, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping into that soft, low register she used when she was thinking out loud. "He's just terrified. Look at his left ear. See how it pins when the bay moves toward him. He isn't fighting the world. He's just protecting his blind side. Someone hit him where he couldn't see it coming." Colton stopped, his hand resting on his saddle horn, his eyes shifting from the horse to the woman beside him. There was a look in Clara's face, a deep, intuitive understanding that didn't come from reading books. It came from knowing exactly what it felt like to be judged as defective by a man who held all the power. "Can I try?" she asked, looking up at him, not with a rope, just with time. Colton hesitated. The frontier was no place for sentimentality. A horse that couldn't be ridden was an expense a working ranch couldn't afford. But looking at Clara, seeing the fierce, quiet need in her eyes to prove that a broken thing still had value, he found he couldn't say no, not alone, and not inside the rail. He said, his tone firm but missing its usual sharpness. "Give him his space, Clara, and keep your eye on his shoulders. A horse will always tell you when he's about to lunge." For the next 5 days, Clara spent an hour every morning sitting on an overturned cedar bucket at the edge of the corral. She didn't approach the stallion. She didn't wave her hands or call out to him. She brought her father's poetry book, her voice rising in a low, rhythmic murmur as she read the verses to the empty Montana air. At first, the stallion stayed on the far side of the enclosure, his head high, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. But the human voice, when it doesn't carry a command, is a strange, hypnotic thing to an animal used to shouts and the crack of leather. By the 3rd day, his ears stopped pinning. By the 5th day, while a light, lazy snow fell over the bitterroot, the stallion took 3 slow, tentative steps forward, his gray muzzle stretching out until his whiskers brushed the edge of her wool sleeve. Colton watched from the barn men trail, his axe resting against his thigh. He had spent his whole life breaking horses the frontier way with round pins, heavy ropes, and a battle of wills that left both man and beast exhausted. What Clara was doing wasn't breaking, it was an invitation. She reached out, her movement so slow it seemed part of the wind, and laid her bare palm against the stallion's neck, right over the pale ridge of an old whip scar. The horse shuddered once, his muscles bunching, but he didn't pull away. He let out a long, blowing snort, his head dropping until it rested near her shoulder. "His name isn't number 4, Clara said, not looking back toward the barn. "An animal needs a name, Mr. Vance. It's the first step toward letting them know they belong somewhere. I'm going to call him Wind, because you can't break the wind, but if you're patient, you can learn to ride it." Colton walked down to the rail, his steps soft in the fresh snow. He stood beside her, looking at the stallion, who remained perfectly still under the touch of her fingers, something the ranch hands hadn't managed in 6 months of trying. "Wind it is," Colton said, his voice carrying a rare, unguarded warmth. He looked at Clara, his gaze lingering on the flush the cold had brought to her cheeks, and the quiet satisfaction settling in her features. She looked different than the frozen girl he'd pulled from the shack. The frontier was still hard, but she was no longer compressed by it. She was revealing herself, piece by piece, as a woman of immense, quiet capability. "You have a gift, Miss Sterling," he said softly. "Most folks come out here wanting to force this country to do what they want. They want to plow the rock, dam the creek, and break the stock until it don't remember its own nature. But the real work, the honest work, is finding a way to get along with what's already here." Clara turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his in the gray winter light. The space between them felt different now, less like a savior and a refugee, and more like two people who had both looked at the blank, lonely walls of a Montana winter and decided they'd rather look at each other. "People aren't any different than horses, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice carrying a steady, informational weight. "When you treat 'em like property, when you use a whip to get what you want, you don't get loyalty. You just get a creature that's waiting for the day it is strong enough to run away. True cooperation, it has to be earned. It can't be bought with a contract." Colton looked away toward the white ridges of the north pasture, her words settling deep into his chest. He had spent 3 years in an absolute, iron-bound silence since his family died, telling himself that the safest way to live was to keep his fence lines high and his circle small. But watching Clara Sterling stand in the snow with a wild horse, he realized that a high fence doesn't just keep the winter out. It keeps the spring from ever finding a place to take root. The trouble with a small valley is that silence travels just as fast as noise. A man can spend a lifetime building a good name, stone by stone, choice by choice, and think he's walled himself off from the worst of what other folks can do. But reputation isn't a mountain. It isn't made of solid rock. It's more like a dirt road after a heavy thaw. One bad wagon can turn the whole thing into a bog before the sun goes down. By the middle of December, the whispers had reached the Vance fence line. It started subtle. It always did. Frank Merritt, who ran the only real supply post down in the settlement, found something urgent to look at in his leather ledger when Colton walked through the door on a Tuesday morning. Two of the eastern neighbors, men Colton had loaned his team of heavy oxen to during the hay harvest, were suddenly very busy checking their horse harness when he passed them on the road men trail. The conversations at the saloon didn't stop when he entered. They just shifted, the way water parts around an intrusive stone. Jed Tanner was a small-minded man, but he wasn't a stupid one. He knew he couldn't beat Colton with a gun or a fist. Colton had 30 channelers on his payroll and enough gold in the bank to buy Jed his quarries twice over. So Jed used the only weapon that didn't leave a blood trail. He used the town's appetite for a dirty story. He told folks that Colton had seduced his mail-order bride right off the wagon. He told them Clara Sterling was a thief who had run away with a purse full of his hard-earned cash. He painted himself as the wronged party, a decent, hard-working citizen whose legal contract had been violated by a wealthy rancher who thought his money put him above the law of the territory. Colton said nothing about it to Clara. He ate her hot biscuits every morning, drank his black coffee, and kept his face arranged into the neutral, unreadable expression of a man who didn't care what the world thought of his business. But Clara wasn't blind. She had grown up in city parlors where women were ruined by a lifted eyebrow or a sharp cough behind a silk fan. She knew the exact temperature of a room from 20 paces. She saw the tight, hard set of Colton's jaw when he came in from the barns each evening. She saw the way his channelers looked at her when they brought the firewood to the porch, not unkindly, but with a cautious, watchful distance. On a Thursday evening, while a dry, powdery snow tapped against the south window, she set a platter of fried pork on the table and stood by her chair, refusing to sit. "People are talking, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was flat, informational. She wasn't asking for pity, and she wasn't shedding tears. "They are saying things about us, about me." Colton didn't look up from his plate right away. He cut a piece of pork, chewed it slow, and swallowed. "Folks in this valley don't have enough chores to keep their minds busy, Miss Sterling. A story gives them something to do besides watch the grass die. They are calling me a thief," she said, her chin lifting. They are saying you took me from his wagon by force. Jed is telling the settlement that I am his legal property, and that you are harboring a runaway. Colton set his knife down with a soft, metallic click. He looked up, his gray eyes perfectly still in the lamplight. Property is a word men use when they want the law to protect their cruelty. Clara, he said, using her Christian name for the first time without realizing it. His voice was a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to settle the air in the cabin. A contract with a Diley stamp on it don't make you a head of cattle. Jed Tanner didn't want a wife. He wanted a title deed to a human soul. The minute he left you in that storm, that paper turned into nothing but a scrap of dirty rags. You don't owe his story a single thought. The town believes him, she countered, her fingers tightening on the back of the wooden chair. Invisibility is being used against us. Colton, they haven't seen me. I'm just an abstraction to them, Jed's runaway. The rich rancher's woman. I want to go into town, next Friday, for the supply run. Colton went still. He thought about it seriously. He thought about the looks, the whispers, the possibility of a direct confrontation on the porch of the supply post. A softer man would have told her to stay hidden, to let the winter pass until the gossip died of starvation. But Colton Vance didn't believe in hiding. He had spent 3 years hiding from his own grief, and it hadn't saved him from a damn thing. All right, he said, his tone leveling out. Next Friday, we ride in together, separate horses. We'll let him look at a person instead of a rumor. The trip into Bitterroot Settlement was exactly what Colton had figured, and nothing he could have fully shielded her from. The minute their horses' hoofbeats crunched on the frozen gravel of the main street, the town went quiet. Not the dead silence of an empty valley, but the heavy, strained quiet of a room that is assessing a threat. Colton kept his eyes straight between his horse ears. Clara rode beside him on Wind, the dappled stallion she had gentled. The horse moved steady, his head low, trusting the small hands on his reins. He didn't lunge or panic at the barking hounds or the rattling buckboards. It was an education for anyone watching a horse that had been deemed a killer 6 weeks ago was now walking down the street like a plow mare, purely because someone had used kindness instead of a whip. They dismounted in front of Frank Merritt's store. Colton tied the horses, offered Clara his hand down not because she needed the help, but because it was a visible sign of respect in front of 20 pairs of eyes. Inside, the air smelled of saltfish, coal oil, and judgment. Frank Merritt stood behind his counter, his face a careful mask of professional neutrality. He nodded once. Colton, ma'am.
Morning.
Frank, Colton said. He laid his supply list on the counter. He didn't volunteer a word. He didn't offer an excuse. Clara didn't look at the floorboards. She looked at the 3 women standing by the dry goods shelves, women who had been whispering into their wool scarves until she walked through the door. She walked directly toward them, her step firm, her blue velvet cloak clean and neat. "Good morning," Clara said to Martha Good, the school teacher who was sorting through a bolt of gray calico. "Mr. Vance tells me you have 23 students in the small schoolhouse on the ridge. That must be an extraordinary amount of labor for one pair of hands." Martha Good froze, a yard of calico held between her fingers. She looked at Clara's dark eyes, then at the fine, educated structure of her face, and finally at the steady way she held herself. There was no shame in Clara's posture. There was no defiance, either, just the simple, plain presence of a human being asking a civil question. It is a chore, ma'am," Martha said, her voice dropping its defensive edge. "The winter makes 'em restless. Back in Boston, my father maintained a small library for the neighborhood children," Clara said, her voice carrying clear and soft through the quiet store. "I have several volumes of English poetry and natural history in my trunk. If your Solder students have need of text for their reading lessons, I would be honored to lend them out. An education shouldn't stop just because the snow is deep." Frank Merritt stopped counting out Colton's sacks of coffee. The men near the stove stopped their low murmuring. In less than 2 minutes, Clara Sterling had ceased to be an abstraction. She wasn't a piece of stolen property or a scandalous rumor. She was a woman who spoke with grace, owned books, and cared about the town's children. By the time Colton finished settling his account, Martha Good had promised to visit the ranch before Christmas, and Frank Merritt had included a small sack of dried apples for the cabin kitchen without charging it to the ledger. But the lightness didn't last past the edge of the settlement. They were 4 miles out, where the timber grew thick and the road narrowed into a rocky trail along the creek, when they found the path blocked. Jed Tanner was there, sitting on his big bay horse right in the middle of the track. He wasn't alone. He'd have brought 3 of his quarry hands, rough men with broken fingernails, heavy coats, and the dull, unthinking eyes of men who did whatever a wealthy master paid them to do. One of them was Deputy Miller, a man who wore a tarnished silver star on his greasy vest and an old Colt revolver strapped low on his thigh. "Vance," Jed shouted, his voice echoing harsh off the stone ridge. "I think it's time we sorted this ledger out. You've had your fun playing the savior, but the law's come to collect my arrangement." Colton pulled the gray mare to a halt. He didn't reach for his Winchester. He didn't shift his weight in the saddle. He just sat there, solid and unyielding as an old oak tree, letting his gaze drift over the 4 men in front of him. "The law don't ride for personal spite, Jed," Colton said, his voice flat and dangerous as a frozen river. "And it sure as hell don't ride for a man who leaves a lady to die in a blizzard." Deputy Miller cleared his throat, his hand resting uncomfortably on his saddle horn. "Colton, the contract is legal. It's got the territorial seal from the St. Louis agency. Jed's got a claim for breach, and he says claiming you reholding property under misrepresentation. I've got a warrant here to bring the woman back to the courthouse for adjudication." Clara didn't pull Wind back. She moved the stallion right up beside Colton's mare, her face pale but her spine straight as a gun barrel. She looked at Jed Tanner, and for the first time, there was no fear in her gaze. There was only a profound, freezing contempt. "You have no warrant that can make me an animal again, Mr. Miller," Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. "A marriage contract requires 2 living souls. Jed Tanner left me in an unheated shack without a match or a blanket. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a death certificate that didn't cost him a court fee." "Shut your mouth, girl," Jed snarled, his face turning an ugly, mottled purple. "You under my name until the judge says otherwise. Move your horse over here, or my boys will haul you off that stallion by your hair." One of the quarry hands took a step forward, his hand reaching for Wind's bridle. Colton Vance didn't raise his rifle, but he didn't have to. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes locking onto the quarry hand with a look that made the man freeze dead in his tracks. "You lay one finger on that horse, or on that lady, and you won't live long enough to see the smoke clear from this ridge," Colton said. He didn't shout. The quietness of his voice was more terrifying than any roar. He looked past the hand, directly at Deputy Miller. "Miller, you take your quarry money and you ride back to town. If Jed wants a legal argument, tell him to make it in front of the circuit judge next month. But if he tries to make it on this trail, with armed men, then it ain't a legal matter anymore. It's a war. And I promise you, Jed, you ain't got enough men in your minds to finish what you're trying to start here today." A long, suffocating silence settled over the trail. The wind whined through the pines, carrying the scent of impending ice. Jed Tanner stared at Colton, his knuckles white on his reins, his chest heaving with a wild, frustrated fury. He looked at his 3 men, but none of them were willing to move. They knew Colton Vance. They knew he didn't make threats he couldn't deliver on a frozen trail. "This isn't over, Vance," Jed spat, pulling his bay horse around with a violent yank. "The law's on my side. I've got the papers. You can keep her forever without paying the price. I tend to make mistakes I can live with." "Jed," Colton said, watching them go, "this is one of them." The 4 men turned and rode back down the trail, their horses' hooves kicking up gray dirt against the white snow. Clara let out a long, slow breath, the breath of a person who had been holding her ground since November. She looked at Colton, her dark eyes wide and searching in the dimming light of the canyon. "He's going to use the courthouse," she said softly. "He's going to try to take your land. Colton, Tom Hadley told Silas that if the hearing goes against you, Jed can sue for contract damages. You could lose everything you've built here. Colton turned his mare toward home. He didn't look back at the trail behind them. A man who's afraid of losing his dirt don't deserve to own it. Clara, he said, each word falling into the rhythm of their horse's steady pace. Land can be bought and sold. Fences can be mended. But a person's right to be treated with dignity. Once you let a man like Jed Tanner take that from you, you ain't got nothing left worth saving anyway. Let him bring his paperwork. We'll be standing right there when the smoke clears. The longest game a mean man can play is the one where he doesn't touch you at all. He just waits on the boundary, squeezing the edges of your life until the space you have left is too small to breathe in. In the 2 weeks that followed the confrontation on the road, Jed Tanner didn't send any more armed men. He didn't call for the deputy. Instead, he applied the pressure where it hurt a frontier rancher most in the infrastructure of the land. On a cold Tuesday morning, Colton rode the eastern boundary of his property and found 300 yards of his barbed wire fence cut clean, not broken by a falling larch tree, not pulled loose by a stray elk. It was snipped with iron wire cutters, the ends of the metal bright and silver against the snow. 20 head of his prime beef cattle had wandered through the gap, onto the rocky timberland owned by Hale Vickers, a man who had done business with Colton on a handshake for 4 seasons. When Colton went to retrieve his stock, Vickers didn't meet his eyes. He sent his foreman out with a typed note, requesting that any future livestock crossings be settled through a formal territorial boundary claim, backed by a cash bond. It was a message. Jed had been having dinners in town. He'd been buying whiskey for the small holders, offering future favors from his quarries, and whispering about morality and the impropriety of a city woman living under a bachelor rancheress roof without a church certificate. The valley was hardening its heart, not because they loved Jed Tanner, but because they were practical men who wanted to be on the side of the Gong Kong Lo, who looked like he was winning. That evening, Colton sat at the kitchen table, his ledgers open under the oil lamp, his large fingers holding a pencil that looked ridiculously small in his hand. Clara came in from the porch, her apron full of dry cedar chips for the morning fire. She took one look at his face, then at the map of the eastern parcel spread across the pine boards. "Tell me," she said. She sat down across from him, her hands folded neat on the table. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered her attention. It was the best thing she had to give. Colton laid his pencil down. He told her about the wire. He told her about Hale Vickers and the whispers at the church chapel. He didn't soft soap it. He didn't dramatize it. Either he gave her the facts, the way a captain gives a report before a hard march. "He's doing it piece by piece," Clara said, her dark eyes reflecting the amber flame of the lamp. She was working it out loud, her mind building the strategy as she spoke. "He wants to weaken your standing before the circuit judge arrives next month. By the time anyone official asks whether you have the right to keep me here, the valley will have already decided you're an outlaw." "That's approximately the size of it," Colton admitted, leaning back in his chair. "People out here are practical first and principled second. Clara, they stay with whoever seems most likely to be standing when the wind dies down. Then we need to look like we're standing," she said, her voice rising with a sudden, sharp intensity. "I want to speak to Sheriff Pratt, not through you, not with you standing over me like a guardian. If you keep speaking for me, Colton, I remain the woman this is happening to. I need to be the woman deciding what happens next. There's a difference." Colton looked at her for 3 full heartbeats. He had spent his life protecting things: his stock, his land, his isolation. His instinct was to say no, to tell her that the frontier courthouse was too rough a place for a lady from Boston. But looking into her eyes, he saw that same stubborn, unyielding light that had kept her alive in the frozen shack. If he refused her now, he'd be doing exactly what Jed had done, treating her like an asset to be managed instead of a human soul with her own agency. "We ride tomorrow at dawn," he said. "I'll hold the horses outside. The office is yours." The Bitterroot Courthouse was a small, square building made of green lumber that smelled of coal oil and old ink. Sheriff Pratt was a man in his 50s, weathered as an old fence post, with the tired, watchful eyes of someone who had spent 20 years adjudicating between competing versions of the truth. He looked up from his desk when Clara walked in alone. He didn't offer her a chair, but she took one anyway, smoothing her wool skirt with a small, precise movement that told him she wasn't there to beg. "Miss Sterling," Pratt said, his voice a cautious drawl. "Colton S. outside. He is tending the horses." "Sheriff," Clara said, her gaze locking onto his across the cluttered desk. "I am here to understand what the territorial law can actually decide regarding my presence in this valley. I want the truth, not the polite version." Pratt leaned back in his chair, his leather vest creaking. He looked at her with a new sort of attentiveness. Most women brought to his office were crying or shouting. This one spoke like a solicitor from the Capitol, in practical terms. "Ma'am," Pratt said, choosing his words with care, "Jed Tanner has a signed contract with a recognized agency. He paid $300 for your passage in your hand. Under territorial law as it stands in 1,826. That paper carries significant weight. Jed is claiming breach of contract and theft of services. He left me to die in an unheated shelter during a November blizzard." "Sheriff," Clara said, her voice dropping into a low, freezing register, "does the law of this territory protect a man's right to commit murder under the guise of an economic arrangement?" Pratt's face shifted, a flicker of genuine discomfort crossing his weathered features. "Jed's story is that he left you at a recognized way station with the expectation of regular traveler traffic. He claims he meant to come back when his wagon axle was set right, an abandonment charge. It's a hard thing to prove when it's just your word against his signed document. The law prefers ink to memory, Miss Sterling. Then the law is a party to his smallness," she said, her voice unyielding. "What could change the judge's mind?" "Witnesses," Pratt said instantly. "Someone who saw the condition you were found in. Someone who knows that road wasn't used by travelers. Or a voluntary dissolution signed by Jed himself. But I don't reckon he's in a mood to sign anything but a warrant." He lowered his voice slightly, leaning forward across the desk. "I'm going to tell you something that isn't in my official ledger. Jed Tanner has allies in the territorial capital. He has been supplying stone for the new government buildings for 2 years. The ground at the hearing next month. It ain't going to be level. Jed knows how to play the public game better than Colton does." Clara stood up. She pulled her velvet cloak around her shoulders, her movements deliberate and calm. "Thank you for your honesty." "Sheriff," she said, "it's rarer in this valley than it should be. But you tell Jed Tanner when he comes in to buy your deputies their tobacco. Tell him that I have spent my whole life being decided about by men who didn't ask my permission. I am done with it. If he wants this contract enforced, he's going to have to do it in front of every living soul in this valley." She walked out of the office, leaving the door open behind her. Colton was waiting by the hitching rail, the gray mare's reins held loose in his hand. He looked at Clara's face as she stepped down onto the frozen mud of the street. He didn't ask what Pratt had said. He didn't have to. The look in her eyes was the look of a soldier who had just surveyed the enemy's lines and decided exactly where to place the artillery. He's playing a public game. "Colton," she said as she swung up into Wynn's saddle. The horse stood rock solid beneath her, his head turning toward the ranch road. "He's using the whispers because we've been playing defense. We've been correct, quiet and isolated. That's not enough anymore." "What's enough?" Colton asked, pulling his horse alongside hers. "We take the room," she said, her voice carrying that same rhythmic, unshakable cadence she had used when she tamed the stallion. "We don't wait for the circuit judge and his capital friends in January. Next Sunday, there is a community gathering at the Harrow Chapel. Every rancher, every miner, and every smallholder will be in that room because habit demands it. Jed will be there in his front pew, looking like a victim." She turned her head, her dark eyes looking straight into Colton's soul. "We walk into that house together," she said. "And you are going to stand up in front of that congregation and tell them exactly what happened on that road in November. You're going to make them look at the truth before Jed has a chance to hide it behind his paperwork." Colton Vance looked out over the white, jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. It was a massive move. It was a dangerous move. It meant taking his private life, his grief, His isolation, his growing feeling for this Boston woman, and bearing it all in front of 100 people who were looking for a reason to judge him. He thought about his 3 years of silence. He thought about his high fences and his quiet cabin. And then he looked at Clara Sterling, sitting on her gray horse in the freezing Montana wind, waiting for him to show her what kind of Gaka boy he really was. "All right," Colton said, his hand tightening on his reins until the mare pricked her ears. "Next Sunday, we take the room. If the Valley wants to pass judgment on my life, they're going to do it with full information. I'll make damn sure of that." The Sabbath in the Bitterroot Valley was not just about the state of a man's soul. It was the one morning of the week when the work stopped, the wagons were greased, and the valley acknowledged its own existence. People came to the timber chapel because habit demanded it. But they stayed because they needed to see who was still standing, who had lost a calf to the blackleg, and whose fence line was being contested. It was the most public room in 100 miles. The cold that Sunday was a personal thing. The sky was a hard, merciless blue that made every ridge and timberline look sharp enough to draw blood. Colton Vance didn't talk much on the ride-in. He rode his big gray mare, and Clara rode beside him on Wind, the dappled stallion. She wore the blue velvet cloak. It was clean now, brushed free of the outpost dust, and she sat her saddle with the kind of quiet, unbothered dignity that makes small men nervous. They didn't ride like folks sneaking into a territory. They rode side by side, their horses' hooves making a steady, rhythmic crunch on the frozen grit of the road. When they pulled up to the hitching rail outside the chapel, the ambient noise changed. The low murmur of men standing by the woodpile died down, the way water goes quiet right before it starts to freeze. Colton swung down, tied his mare, and walked over to Winda's side. He offered Clara his hand. He didn't rush it. He let every pair of eyes watching from the porch register the gesture. It wasn't about being polite. It was about establishing a fact. He was claiming her safety in the open light of day. They walked through the heavy timber doors together. The chapel was packed tight, tighter than Colton had seen it since the gold strike 3 seasons back. Word had traveled through the timber that the Vance business was coming to a head. Jed Tanner was already there, sitting in the front pew on the right side. He had dressed for the occasion a clean wool coat, his hair combed wet, his face arranged into the patient, heavy expression of a respectable citizen who had been wronged but was being Christian about it. Reverend Cole, a thin, earnest man who looked like he'd been chewed on by the winter, stood by the pine pulpit. He looked deeply unhappy about the temperature of the room he was in. He opened his Bible, took out his spectacles, and looked at Colton and Clara walking down the center aisle. Colton didn't wait for the opening hymn. He didn't wait for Cole to clear his throat. He walked straight to the front of the room, right past Jed's pew, turned his back on the altar, and faced the congregation. The murmur that went through the benches was loud enough to rattle the stovepipe. "Neighbors," Colton said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that deep, iron-hard resonance that comes from 30 years of giving orders in the wind. It reached the back wall without an ounce of effort. "I'm asking for your patience before the service begins. What I have to say concerns everyone who lives under the law of this valley. And it won't take long." Jed Tanner stood up, his leather boots creaking loud on the floorboards. "Cole, this ain't a town meeting. This man has no right to turn a house of worship into a courtroom for his own scandalous behavior. Let him speak." Jed, a voice called out from the left side. It was old Joe Greer, 72 years old, sitting with his gnarled hands resting on a hickory cane. Joe had outlasted every debt and every winter the valley could throw at him, and he didn't care about anyone's permission. "We've been listening to your version of this ledger at the saloon for 3 weeks. Let's hear what the other side looks like." Jed glared at Joe, but the old man didn't flinch. Reverend Cole looked at the set of Colton's jaw and slowly sat down on his wooden bench behind the pulpit. He knew when a fire had already caught the grass. Colton looked at the room, finding the faces of the small holders, the channelers, the women who had looked away from Clara at the supply post. "Most of you know there's been a dispute on my boundary," Colton said, his cadence slow and rhythmic, matching the steady beat of a man walking a fence line. You've heard that Jed Tanner brought a lady west under a signed marriage contract, and that she's been living under my roof since November. You've heard his ink and paper version of how that came to be. He paused, letting the silence stretch until the pop of the woodstove sounded like a pistol shot. But you haven't heard the truth, Colton continued, his eyes locking onto Jed. I found Clara Sterling in the old timber outpost on the South Road during the height of the November blizzard. She was curled against her trunk, half buried in snow, with her lips blue and her breath nearly gone. She had been left there by the man sitting in that front pew. A sharp collective intake of breath went through the benches. Several women leaned forward, their eyes shifting to Clara, who stood near the back door, her head high, her dark eyes perfectly steady. Jed claims he left her there to wait for the northern stagecoach because his wagon axle was throwing grease, Colton said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, level register. But Joe Greer worked that South Freight Road for 20 years. Tell this room how many stages have run past that outpost since the territory shifted the mail route. Joe Greer didn't stand up, but his voice carried clear enough. Ain't been a wheel turn on that track since the spring of 1817. Colton, the road's dead. Jed Tanner knows it's dead. He owns the timber parcel right next to it. The room went completely still. The silence had weight now, the heavy, cold weight of an ugly truth laid out on white pine boards. He left her there because she told him she couldn't have children, Colton said, each word falling like a hammer on an anvil. He looked at a human soul, decided she was a bad investment, and discarded her in a freeze rather than pay a court fee to dissolve the contract. I want every man who owns a home in this Thung Lung to think about what that means, not as a matter of territorial law, but as a matter of human decency. If we protect the paper instead of the person, then we ain't a community at all. We just wolves sharing woods. Jed's face had gone the color of raw beef. He took a step toward Colton, his fists clenched at his sides, his rehearsed patience completely fracturing. You broke a lawful contract, Vance. You took a woman who belonged under my name and you was been harboring her for your own pleasure. You want to talk about decency? Ask her why she's living with a bachelor rancher. Sit, Jed. The voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute authority of 30 years in a schoolroom. Martha Good stood up from the fourth row, her arms folded across her wool shawl. She looked around the chapel, making eye contact with every mother and father in the room. You left a woman in a blizzard. Jed Tanner, Martha said, her precision doing the work that volume couldn't. She nearly died. If Colton Vance hadn't found her, we'd be digging a grave for her come spring. I want to ask the people in this house, what story would we have told ourselves then? Would we have looked at his legal contract and said it was just an unfortunate frontier accident and gone back to our tea? Or would we have known we had a murderer living among us? Jed looked at the deputy standing by the side door, but Miller was looking at his own boots. The room had shifted. It wasn't a wave or a tide. It was the slow, massive turning of a mountain slide. The women in the pews were looking at Clara now, and then, one by one, they began to move. Mrs. Merritt stood up first, walking across the aisle to stand by Clara's side. Then Martha Good followed. In less than a minute, a dozen women had formed a solid, unyielding wall around the Boston girl. Jed turned on Colton, his voice cracked with a wild, frustrated fury. You think you've won something here. You want her. Say it plainly. Vance, stop hiding behind your sermon. Tell the valley what it's costing you to keep another man's property. All right, Colton said. He turned his back on Jed entirely. A visible, deliberate choice, and looked across the crowded room directly at Clara. The rhythmic pause in his speech was the only sign of the emotion working beneath his ribs. I'll say it plainly in front of God and every witness in this valley. He took a breath, his voice steady as an iron rail. Miss Sterling, you can leave this valley tomorrow as a free individual. I will provide the horses, the wagon, and the gold required to take you to any territory you choose, to start a life without an ounce of obligation to any man alive, including me. That offer stands regardless of what happens next. He stopped. The room so quiet you could hear the wind whining through the roof shingles. Or you can stay on my property as an equal, not as a charity case, not as a kept woman under an agency arrangement, but as a partner, someone I would be honored to build a life and a home with. The choice is entirely yours. No contracts, no transactions. Just a plain agreement between two free people. Jed made a choked sound, a mix of laugh and rage. But old Joe Greer slammed his hickory cane against the floor. The contract was voided the minute you put her in the snow to die. Jed, I'll sign my name to that in front of any circuit judge the Capitol sends down. Your ink's gone bad. Sheriff Pratt moved from the middle aisle, his silver star glinting in the cold light from the high windows. He looked at Jed with the tired, final expression of a man whose job had just become simple. Mr. Tanner, Pratt said formally, Joe's testimony regarding the road, combined with the condition the lady was found in, gives my office sufficient cause to suspend your complaint. Furthermore, I'd advise you that pursuing this matter to a territorial court carries significant risk to your own standing. An endangerment charge. It's a lot harder to fight than a breach of contract. Jed looked at the sheriff. He looked at the wall of women standing by Clara. He looked at Colton Vance, who stood like an unyielding stone ridge in front of the altar. He knew he had lost, not just the woman, but his reputation, his leverage, and his place in the valley. This isn't finished, Jed muttered. His words meant to sound like a threat, but they carried the hollow, rattled cadence of a man who had run out of moves. It says finished for today. Jed, Pratt said quietly, I suggest you take your wagon and go home. Jed turned and walked down the aisle, his boots heavy and loud in the silent church. His quarry hands followed him, their heads down, looking like men who had backed the wrong horse in a bad race. The chapel seemed to breathe then a long, collective sigh that rattled the frosted windows. Colton didn't move. He kept his eyes on the back of the room, where the wall of women was slowly parting, leaving Clara Sterling standing alone in the winter light. The formal record from Sheriff Pratt's office was updated on a Wednesday. It didn't carry any poetic language. Legal documents in the territories were thinned out, dry and brief. But what it said in the neat script of the clerk was that the complaint filed by Jed Tanner had been reviewed in light of new testimony and found to lack sufficient grounds for adjudication. The abandonment categorization stood. Jed's marriage claim was suspended indefinitely. By the second week of February, Jed had sold his stone quarries to an investment group from Great Falls and left the Bitterroot land tour for good. He vanished into the southern territories without a single man from the valley riding out to shake his hand. But the routine of the Vance ranch didn't change with his leaving. Fences still needed mending. The cattle required hay every morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. And the woodbox by the cabin stove had a way of emptying itself twice a day, on a clear, bright Friday afternoon. Colton saddled the gray mare and led Wind out of the corral. The dappled stallion moved with a proud, easy stride now, his head low, his eyes dark and calm. The whip scars on his flanks were still there, pale lines against his gray coat, but they were just history now. They didn't dictate his movement anymore. Clara came out onto the cabin porch, pulling her leather gloves on, her dark hair tucked neat under a wool scarf. She looked at the two horses, then at Colton. We re-going for a ride, Miss Sterling, Colton said, his voice carrying that steady, comfortable rhythm that had become the music of the cabin. The frost is holding, but the winds died down enough to see the valley. They rode east, away from the main ranch buildings, up a long, sweeping trail that wound through the heavy ponderosa pines. The snow was deep here, untouched by cattle or wagons, a pure white sheet that reflected the brilliant blue of the winter sky. Wind moved under Clara with a total, unguarded cooperation. His ears pricked forward, responding to the slightest shift of her weight in the saddle. They cleared the timberline and came out onto a wide, flat bench of land that overlooked the entire southern fork of the creek. It was a grand place. The soil beneath the snow was deep black loam, protected from the north wind by a massive ridge of red granite, and the view stretched out for 50 miles toward the jagged white teeth of the mountains. Colton pulled the mare to a stop. He reached into his heavy sheepskin coat, pulled out a folded piece of parchment with a red territorial seal on it, and handed it across the space between their horses. Clara took it, her fingers careful inside her gloves. She unfolded it and read the lines of official text. It was a deed of ownership, legally recorded at the Capitol Land Office, for the exact 5 acres of ground they were standing on. The name on the deed was Clara Sterling. She looked at the paper, then up at Colton, her dark eyes wide with a sudden, searching intensity. "Mr. Vance," Colton, this is the eastern parcel, the best timberland on the ranch. It's your land, Clara, Colton said. He leaned his forearms on his saddle horn, his gray eyes perfectly steady as he looked at her. He didn't rush the words. He let them fall into the quiet of the mountain air like seed into a fresh furrow. "From this day on, you're an independent landowner in Montana. It's registered in your name, legal and tight. If you decide to pack your trunk tomorrow and take the train back to Boston, this ground is still yours to sell or keep as you see fit. No man can ever tell you to leave this valley, and no one can use your lack of a home to dictate your choices again." Clara's fingers trembled slightly against the parchment, the raw emotion of the gesture hitting her like a physical blow. In her 30 years of life, men had offered her many things. They had offered her positions, arrangements, an allowance, and a place in someone else's plan. But nobody had ever offered her a way out before they offered her a reason to stay. By giving her the land first, Colton was stripping away every ounce of economic dependence. He was making her his equal before the law and before the world. "Why did you do this?" she whispered, her voice cracking just enough to show the cracks in her armor. "You didn't have to prove anything to me, Colton, not after the chapel. A woman who's been treated like transferable property needs something that belongs to no soul but her own." "Clara," Colton said, his voice dropping into a low, gentle rumble, "I wanted it established. I wanted you to know that your right to breathe this air and live on this dirt don't depend on my goodwill or any man's contract. It depends on you." He swung down from the gray mare, his boots making a firm, deep crunch in the snow. He walked over to Wynn's side, laid his large hand on the stallion's neck, and looked up at her. The horse stood perfectly still, trusting the man because the woman trusted him. "Now that's settled," Colton said, tugging the brim of his hat down against the glare of the sun, "I want to ask you a question properly, without Jed Tanner's shadow over the trail, without the hearing or the warrant or the question of where you go if you left." He held her gaze, his eyes clear and unblinking. "I want to ask whether you'd want to make this permanent. Clara, I want to ask if you'll do me the honor of marrying me. Not because it's a practical arrangement for the ranch, and not because of what the folks in town are saying. I stopped making choices based on the whispers some months back. I'm asking because I want you by my side, because the cabin's different when you re-in it. The air's got a different density to it, and I don't reckon I want to go back to the silence I had before you arrived." Clara looked down at the deed in her hand, then at the vast, beautiful, unforgiving country around them, and finally at the Cowboy standing in the snow by her stirrup. He was a large man, thinned out and hardened by the frontier, but beneath that faux-wrap wool coat was a dying zoo that was as solid as the granite ridge behind them. "I am not an easy person to live with, Colton," she said, a faint trembling smile finally breaking across her lips. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't always keep them to myself. I intend to plant things on these 5 acres that may not suit the frost, and they will probably fail the first season." "Probably," Colton agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The kitchen garden layout's going to be a hard fight every April, I imagine. And I still don't know if I can give you the family you might want," she added, her voice dropping into a softer, more vulnerable register. A physician in Boston don't know the nature of this valley." "Clara," Colton interrupted gently, his hand reaching up to cover hers where it rested on the saddle horn. "And I ain't looking for a line item on a ledger. I am looking for you. If it's just the 2 of us and these pines until the winter takes us, then that's enough for me." "It's more than enough." Clara let out a long, slow sigh, the last of the old frost finally leaving her spirit. She stepped down from the saddle, her boots sinking into the snow beside his, and let her head rest against the solid, warm wool of his sheepskin coat. "Yes, Colton Vance," she whispered into the wind. "I will marry you." He didn't yell. He didn't make a grand display of his triumph. He just wrapped his large arms around her, holding her tight against the Montana cold, while Wind stood nearby, his dark eyes watching the horizon. What Colton felt in that moment wasn't something big or dramatic. It was just the simple, quiet feeling of a door that had been jammed for 3 winters finally opening without a groan. It was the ordinary ease of a thing that was supposed to move. "Moving. Good," Colton said, his chin resting against the velvet of her hood. "The ledgers down at the cabin are 3 days behind, Mrs. Vance. They won't organize themselves. They certainly won't." Clara agreed, her short, soft laugh catching him off guard and lightening the freezing air between them. "Let's go home." Colton. They mounted their horses and rode back down the mountain trail, side by side, their shadows long and golden against the white snow. The frontier didn't offer any guarantees. Fences would still get cut. The blizzards would come back every November, and the distance between people would always be larger than the map suggested. But as they turned the horses toward the yellow light of the cabin window, Colton knew that the size of a life isn't determined by what a man protects himself from. It's determined by what he decides to stand behind. And he'd found exactly where he belonged. They married in March, on a day that could quite decide between winter and spring. The sky was the color of a wet slate stone, and the mud along the settlement road was that deep, stubborn frontier muck that tried to claim a wagon wheel at every turn. It wasn't a soft day. It was damp, cold, and thoroughly honest. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony in the Harrow Chapel, standing behind the same pine pulpit where the room had turned against Jed Tanner a month before. Cole had a slightly overwhelmed expression, the look of a man who hadn't entirely recovered from the Sunday Kentucky in February and was praying this sequel wouldn't involve any armed standoffs. Martha Good and old Joe Greer stood as witnesses. Tom Hadley occupied the back bench, his large hands resting on his knees, looking genuinely but uncomfortably moved by the whole business. It was a short ceremony. Neither Colton nor Clara were people who needed a large volume of words to make a thing real. They said their vows into the quiet of the timber room, their voices level and rhythmic. A plain agreement between two people who had already looked at the worst of what the country could do and decided to face it together. Afterward, Joe Greer shook Colton's hand on the porch, his gnarled fingers gripping tight. "You did all right, Vance," the old man said, his head nodding once. "You did all right." It was the highest compliment in Joe's entire vocabulary, and Colton received it accordingly. The walk back to the horses was memorable mostly because Windock decided to celebrate the occasion by refusing to move a single inch at the edge of the creek trail. The dappled stallion stood rock solid in the mud for 4 full minutes, his ears pricked toward a patch of melting ice, ignoring every soft tug on his leather reins. Clara didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for a switch. She just stood in the damp muck, her blue velvet cloak tucked back over her arm, and spoke to the animal in that low, patient murmur she used in the dead of December. Eventually, the horse let out a long snort, dropped his head, and stepped forward into the stride she asked for. Colton watched the whole thing from the back of his gray mare, a faint ghost of a smile working at the corners of his mouth. "You laughing, Mr. Vance," Clara said as she swung up into her saddle, her boots wet with the thaw mud. "I ain't laughing, Clara," Colton said, turning his horse toward the ranch road. "You are," she countered, her dark eyes flashing with that quiet, unguarded warmth he'd come to rely on. "You're laughing internally. I can see it in the way you hold your reins." "It's possible," Colton admitted. "A horse that won't move on your wedding day. It keeps a man from getting too sentimental about his own arrangements." April came to the Bitterroot the way it always comes to the mountain country, grudgingly at first, then with a sudden, almost aggressive generosity that made you forget how long and dark the freeze had been. The snow retreated up the granite ridges, leaving behind a damp, steaming earth that smelled of ancient pine needles and fresh mud. The creek along the southern boundary, which had been locked under 6 inches of solid ice since late November, opened itself up with a roaring, rushing music that Colton could hear from the barn doorway at dawn. It was the sound of things beginning again. Clara planted her 5 acres. She put in the practical things first: a large kitchen garden near the cabin, wild herbs for the pantry, greens that could survive a late frost. But among the rows of potatoes and onions, she put down things that had no economic value at all. She planted flowers, wild mountain lilies, columbine, and seeds she brought from her mother's garden in Boston. Colton watched her from the fence line, his post-hole digger resting against his thigh. A traditional frontier rancher would have looked at those rows of flowers and seen a waste of good loam, a distraction from the real business of survival. But Colton Vance had learned something about the economy of a human soul over the winter. A woman who had nearly been buried by the winter had earned the right to put something in the dirt that existed purely to be beautiful. Survival was the method, but beauty was the reason you stayed to see the next season through. In the second week of May, Kaingsat Chung Pratt rode out to the cabin. He arrived on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the stone peaks, leaving the valley in a long, amber twilight. He didn't dismount right away. He sat on his bay horse by the Porchman Trail, holding his hat in both hands, turning it slow by the brim, the look a man carries when he's bringing a burden he's not sure he has the right to set down. Colton stepped out onto the porch, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. "Come in, Pratt. The pot's hot." Pratt swung down, stepped onto the cedar logs of the porch, and nodded to Clara as she appeared in the doorway. He didn't take a chair. He stood by the hearth, looking at his hat. "There's a situation over on the Eastern Fork," Pratt said, his voice carrying the flat, heavy cadence of a man who had spent the day looking at hard realities. "The Calloway place. Daniel Calloway died of the chest fever back in March. His widow, she followed him 3 weeks ago. The cabin's cold." Colton went still. Daniel Calloway had been a smallholder, a quiet man who tried to farm a rocky patch of ground 8 miles east. The frontier news traveled slow, and the death hadn't fully registered on the Vance slate of concerns. "There are 2 children," Pratt continued, looking up, his eyes tired under the lamp. "Ellis is 9. Clara is 6. They've been staying with old Mrs. Finch down at the timber mine, but she's 78 and her own knees are giving out. She can't keep 'em. The Territorial Orphan Board. They won't send a representative down from the capital until July at the earliest. Every rancher I've asked. They've got their own mouths to feed or no room under the roof." The cabin went entirely silent. The pop of the larchwood in the stove sounded loud in the room. Colton looked at Clara. She didn't flinch. She was looking at Pratt with that same intense, calculating expression she'd used when she surveyed the dappled stallion in the corral. "What are they like?" "Kaingsat Chung?" she asked, her voice soft but unyielding. "The children." Pratt sighed, his shoulders dropping. "The boy's angry. Mrs. Vance. He's 9 years old. He lost both parents inside of a month, and he says decided the world's his enemy. He don't trust nothing that speaks to him. The little girl, she is just quiet. She follows her brother like a shadow and don't say a word." Clara turned her gaze back to Colton. They didn't need to have a long discussion. They had spent the winter learning how to read the spaces between each other's thoughts. They thought about the extra room in the back of the cabin, the space Colton had cleared out for Clara when she first arrived, furnished with a solid cot, a pine trunk, and a small oil lamp. The house was larger than 2 people required. "We have the room, Colton," Clara said simply, "and we have the bread." Colton looked at Pratt, tugging his belt straight. "Bring 'em out Friday, Kaingsat Chung. Give Clara 2 days to get the blankets washed and the room sorted." Pratt let out a long breath, the tension leaving his face for the first time since he'd ridden into the yard. "I appreciate this, Vance. Both of you don't appreciate it yet." "Kaingsat Chung," Clara said with her characteristic directness, her hand reaching for the coffee pot to fill his cup. "An angry child is labor. It's harder work than breaking a horse or digging a mine. We'll see what kind of job we can do with them before you send the capital paperwork." The children arrived on Friday afternoon in the back of Pratt's buckboard. Ellis Calloway stepped down onto the dirt yard with his jaw set hard, his small fist shoved deep into the pockets of an old, oversized wool coat. He looked at the Vance cabin, the large barns, and the high fences with the sharp, defensive glare of a creature looking for an exit. Clara held his sleeve, her eyes wide as saucers, her small face pale under a dirty bonnet. Colton didn't offer a loud welcome. He didn't use that false, cheerful voice folks sometimes use with frightened children. He walked over, dropped down on one knee in the dirt so he was matching the boy's height, and looked Ellis straight in the eyes. "You don't have to like it here, son," Colton said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that didn't carry an ounce of demand. "And you don't have to be comfortable right away. That ain't required under this roof." Ellis stared at him, his small chest heaving with a defensive heat. "What is required, then?" the boy asked, his tone sharp with the combative edge of a child waiting for the blow. Colton stood up, his large frame blocking the north wind. "That you don't hurt the stock," he said plain style, "and that you eat what Clara puts on the table, because her cooking's too good to be wasted by a stubborn mind. Beyond that, we'll figure the chores out as the sun moves." The boy didn't answer, but he didn't look for an exit either. He stood his ground, his small boots planted in the Vance dirt, processing the fact that he hadn't been lied to or patronized. From behind her brother's arm, little Clara looked past the horses and spotted the green rose of the eastern parcel. She looked up at the woman standing on the porch. "Do you have flowers?" the girl asked, her voice a tiny whisper that barely carried across the yard. "I do, Clara," Clara Vance said, stepping down from the porch, her movements slow and easy, they just starting to show their heads through the frost. "If you like, tomorrow morning when the lights clear, we can go out and see which ones are strong enough to keep growing." The little girl nodded once, a solemn businesslike agreement, and let her hand slide into her brother's pocket to hold his fingers. The summer that followed was the hardest, loudest, and most populated season Colton had ever spent in the Bitterroot Valley. Ellis was a storm of a boy. He broke a cedar corral post in June out of pure, unthinking fury, and then spent 3 hours in the blistering sun helping Colton dig the rock out to replace it, not because anyone commanded him to, but because he couldn't stand the sight of a man doing a chore he was strong enough to share. It was an education in the boy's nature. His opposition always gave way to decency if you gave him enough space to find it on his own. Little Clara spent her mornings in the eastern parcel, her small fingers sorting seeds into paper envelopes with a total, silent concentration that mirrored the woman beside her. She talked more in 3 weeks than she had in the previous 6 months, her memory for the names of wild plants revealing itself as an extraordinary wealth she'd been hoarding in her silence. In October, the formal paperwork arrived from the Capitol Land Office, bearing the heavy gold seal of the Territorial Guardian Board. It was official. The children were theirs under the law. Colton found Ellis in the south barn after the sun had gone down. The boy was 9 now, his shoulders broader from 5 months of ranch work, and he was working a brush over the gray mare's flanks with a steady, rhythmic stroke. The mare's foal, a leggy gray filly born in August, stood nearby in the straw, watching the boy with enormous liquid eyes. Colton leaned his forearms over the stall door, the scent of seasoned hay and clean horses heavy in the dark. "The papers came from the Capitol today, Ellis," Colton said quietly. "It's legal. You and the little one stay here for good." The boy didn't stop brushing. The bristles made a firm, reassuring scratch against the mare's hide. He worked for 3 full heartbeats before he spoke. "Does that mean we gotta change our names to Vance?" "No," Colton said, his voice level. "Calloway belongs to you. Your father built a good name on that eastern fork, and nobody has got the right to take that from your ledger. You keep it." Another long silence. The brush moved down the mare's shoulder. "Clara asked me today," Ellis muttered, his face turned toward the horse's mane so Colton couldn't see his eyes. "She asked if she could call Mrs. Vance something else. Not that name. Something closer." Colton didn't move. He kept his hand steady on the stall door. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was her own choice," the boy said, his voice dropping into that oblique, sideways register boys use when they re-speaking about things that actually matter to their souls. I told her a name is something you give a person when you feel it, not because the Kangsat Chung says it S-time. Colton felt a sudden, sharp tightness behind his ribs, a clean, healing pain that belonged to a man who was no longer dead inside. He reached out, his large hand resting on the boy's shoulder for one brief second before he pulled it back. You told her right, son. You told her exactly right. When Colton walked back into the cabin, the lamps were lit. Clara was sitting at the pine table, her fingers guiding little Clara's hand as they sorted the last of the marigold seeds into a blue paper envelope for the next spring's planting. The little girl had flour on her elbow from the evening biscuits, her face twisted into an expression of total, joyous focus. Clara Vance looked up as her husband entered. Colton gave her a short, slow nod, the signal that the paperwork was settled, that the foundation was secure. Something moved in her face then, not a smile, but a deep, quiet look of completion. She pressed her lips together, her eyes shining in the yellow lamplight, and then she looked back down at the blue envelope. This one goes in the center, Clara, she said softly. I know, the little girl replied with the absolute certainty of a child who knew exactly where she belonged. I've been paying attention. That evening, after the children were asleep in their cots, Colton and Clara sat out on the porch benches. It was an October freeze, the serious kind that turned a man's breath to white steam the minute it left his lips. They had thick wool blankets pulled around their shoulders, and the Montana sky above them was a vast, terrifying velvet sheet crowded with a million cold stars. This isn't what I planned when I boarded that train in St. Louis, Colton, Clara said, her eyes fixed on the dark outline of the pines against the ridge. I planned to be adequate. I thought if I could just fit neat enough into someone else's arrangement, I could call it a life. I was so very tired. Colton reached out beneath the blankets, his large, rough hand finding hers, his fingers locking between her fingers. He held her hand tight against his thigh, sharing the warmth. Are you still tired, Clara? He asked. She turned her head, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight, her face clear and still in the cold night air. Sometimes, she said softly. But it's a different kind of weight now. It's the tiredness that comes from doing, from building something real with your own hands, rather than just enduring what other men decide for you. There's a grand difference between the two. There is, Colton agreed. They sat in the quiet of the Bitterroot night, listening to the vast, indifferent wilderness around them. Somewhere out in the dark pasture, a horse shifted in the snow, the pale gray filly getting used to her own legs in the frost. It had been a year since Colton Vance had ridden out to his boundary line and seen a thin blue velvet cloak passing his gate. A year since he pulled a frozen girl from a rotting way station and told her that every human soul had a right to its own breath. He hadn't become a better man over that year. He hadn't become a transformed or elevated version of himself. He was still the same Thor Rapp, quiet gang cowboy who had mended fence on a cold Thursday and spent 3 seasons telling himself that minimum exposure was the safest way to live. But he had different information now about what minimum exposure actually cost a man's honor. The frontier doesn't offer a guarantee. It never has. The soil is hard. The winters are long. And the distance between human beings will always look larger than the maps suggest. Things fail. Fences get cut, and the fever can take a life in 4 short days. But sometimes, on the edge of all that white wilderness, a person makes a choice that costs more than they figured, and returns more than they ever had the right to expect. And the return isn't a grand wave or a solved equation. It's a lamp burning faint in a child's room. It's a woman planting lilies in unsuitable dirt because she needs to see something grow. It's an angry boy brushing down a mare every evening because the horse requires his presence, and he has found, without a single contract being signed, that being needed is a hell of a lot better than being unchosen. Love, in the end, isn't a thing you find in the easy places. You build it out of whatever you have at hand: imperfect people, limited resources, and a massive amount of uncertainty about the winter. You build it in the hard seasons by choosing each other when the choosing costs you everything you own. Colton Vance stood up, picked up his empty cup, and opened the heavy log door of the cabin. The fire inside was banked for the night, throwing a warm, red glow across the clean floorboards. The house was quiet, but it was the quiet of a place full of living, breathing souls, the quiet of a home. He went inside and closed the door against the winter, while outside, the stars continued their long, cold work over the Bitterroot Valley, holding the 5 eastern acres and the flowers that would surely come up when the spring returned.
This story is designed as cinematic long-form entertainment and may contain exaggerated emotions, dramatic coincidences, or heightened tension to create a more engaging experience for viewers. Certain scenes have been intentionally intensified for storytelling and emotional impact. As someone who has spent the better part of my life tracing the deep ruts of our history with a pen, trying to capture the elusive soul of the frontier, I find myself sitting with this tale long after the lamps have been put out. You see, when a story travels from the formal parlor rooms of Boston all the way out to the jagged, gray stone ridges of Montana, it changes shape. It sheds its excess weight. The frontier has a way of acting like a sieve. It shakes loose the pretense, the polite talk, and the pretty illusions, until you are left with nothing but the raw, unpolished truth of who a person really is. When Jed Tanner pulled his wagon to a halt on that frozen road, he didn't just leave Clara Sterling in an abandoned line shack. He abandoned the very concept of human decency. To a man like Jed, the world was a flat ledger of transactions, inputs, and economic returns. He looked at a woman who carried the quiet grief of a childhood injury and decided she was a bad investment, a broken piece of machinery that didn't fit the specifications of his order. He left her in the snow, trusting the bitter winter to do the ugly work he didn't have the stomach to do himself. But the West, for all its harshness, has a funny way of balancing its own books. It gave Clara, Colton Vance, the moral of the story, the sovereignty of the soul. If you look closely at the architecture of this story, you'll find that its true value isn't found in a dramatic shootout or a grand poetic declaration of love. The lesson is far more profound. A human being's worth is settled the day they are born, and no contract, no transaction, and no small-minded man has the right to put a price tag on your dignity. Think of how Colton handled that freezing night. He didn't ride out into that howling whiteout to be a romantic hero. He rode out because under the unwritten law of the country, a human life is a sacred trust. When he brought Clara under his roof, he didn't demand her gratitude or try to collect a debt. He brought in the local midwife to protect her reputation. He kept his distance to protect her peace. And when she offered to work to pay her way, he reminded her that she would stand on his ranch as an equal, not as an unfree debtor begging for a warm corner. And what a beautiful thing happened when Clara began to find her feet. She didn't try to master the land with a whip or a heavy hand. She gentled the dappled stallion, the horse the hands called Number 4, not by breaking his spirit, but by offering him an invitation of safety. She recognized that his wild streak was just a defense mechanism for his blind side, the very same blind side the world had used to strike her down. A lesson for the audience, moving beyond minimum exposure. When Colton and Clara walked into the Harrow Chapel that Sunday morning, they did something extraordinary. They took the room. They refused to let the whispers and the invisible judgment of the valley dictate their lives. Colton stood up in front of his neighbors, bared his private life, and exposed the truth. But notice what he did next. He didn't claim Clara. He didn't make a new contract. He handed her a deed to 5 acres of the best timberland on the ranch, registered completely in her name. He gave her a way out before he gave her a reason to stay. He stripped away every ounce of her economic dependence, making her an independent woman before he ever asked her to be his wife. Because Colton Vance understood that true cooperation can never be bought. It can only be earned between two entirely free souls. The story doesn't end with a flawless paradise. The winter still comes back to the Bitterroot Valley every November, and fences still get cut. But look at what they built from the scraps of their lives. They took in the Calloway children, an angry, grieving boy, and a quiet little girl, and they gave them a foundation. They didn't force them to change their names. They gave them space to find their own choices.